Good morning, everybody. How's it going? All right. I love you guys. Thank you for cheering for me. Not to tell tales about people in church. I don't want you guys to be afraid to talk to me because then I'm going to talk about it on the stage. But honestly, I need some good material, so keep it coming, We sat down after the first song and they're like, already, because we love to worship. It was just awesome to worship here each and every Sunday at Element Church. So thank you to our worship team, to Eric for leading us with your whole heart. I appreciate that. Jared, for your passion each and every week. We're just so blessed. We're so blessed. And not just the worship team, but everybody who's here to make an amazing Sunday at Element. Man, it's the best time all week, if I do say so myself. And I'm never wrong, so it's the best time all week. All right. My name is Buzz, and for the last several weeks here, I've had the privilege of serving as the lead pastor. And for the last 3 weeks here, we've been going through the book of Nehemiah and seeing how God shaped him into a man, a leader, a change agent in many ways in his world. And I've loved it. We've burned all sorts of stuff up here on stage. Amazing, safety first. And then today we're going to do, something a little bit different. But what I've loved about Nehemiah is that he suffered just like we do, right? He had the pressures just like we do, and yet he was able to faithfully follow God anyway. Right, but today, as we end our series looking at chapter 13, so after 12 chapters of following God faithfully, what's going to happen to Nehemiah right at the last chapter, right? And so let me ask you this question. Have you ever done everything right and then it all burned down anyway? Does this ever happen? I see some heads nodding. I see some I don't want it on my heads, This is not just Nehemiah, this is us, right? Have you ever done everything right and then everything burned down anyway? Have you worked hard? You done the right things? You said the right yes and the right no, and then you had God kind of spark something in your heart, like a commitment back to Him in blazing fire, and then yet something even so catches fire that shouldn't have, and your life just ends up kind of, through no fault of your own, on fire. When I was younger, I got to see this principle up close. You might remember a couple weeks ago, I talked about burning down my friend John's shed, and then here we lit the sparkler on fire, and we saw the fireworks display last week, and none of those I was really very afraid. But when I was 8 and it was time to go out there, we had a garage full of trash. What do you do when you live in the country and you have a garage full of trash? What do? You burn it. That's what I'm talking about. In fact, my dad saw my own garage just yesterday, and Dad's down here, so he can tell you if it's true or not. Right, Dad? Okay. He said, there's so many boxes, we should burn them. And honestly, we should have learned our lesson, because when I was 8 years old, it was time to burn the trash. It kind of been a long winter. We had, we lived beyond the city limits, so the trash collectors wouldn't come. We piled it up, and, Mom had a home business where she'd sell longer burger baskets, so we had more cardboard boxes than the average person. This is all pre-Amazon, but we had a lot of boxes anyway, And we got to get rid of it. We got to make space in the garage. We got to bring some fresh life in there. We got to be able to just clean out and prune up and get ready for the season. Time to burn the trash. So we lugged it all out there to the burn pile. We even had a burn pile because we've done this dozens of times, if not hundreds of times. When you're 8, it feels like you do the chores millions of times. We've done it every time, no problem. Stack up the trash, stack up the boxes, light it, Now, this is early March or whatever, kind of the first nice day after the end of a long winter, and near Kansas City. And in Wyoming, you guys keep telling me about the wind. And it's like you guys feel like you have a monopoly on the wind. You do not, okay? There's wind other places too. I think that what you do here in Cheyenne is you get the wind, you collect it, you put some wrapping paper on it, bows, you send it nice, gently east to bless those other states, including Kansas. And on one of those days in early March, you sent me a beautiful gift of wind. So beautiful, it just gently picked up one of those burning boxes from the trash fire and just deposited it graciously in the tall, dry grass in our field. Thank you for the wind in Wyoming. We love it. We love it. At the beginning of the series, I said we had to take so long to kind of spark that shed into fire over and over and over again. We had no problems this March setting a fire. It hit that grass and it just launched right into flame. And you ever done something and you kind of wonder, is this going to be a problem or whatever? You kind of think, you get some advice, and then you've done something and you're like, this is absolutely a problem immediately. That was one of those days. I was 8 years old, and even I knew that it was going to be a problem. So Dad ran up to the house, and he grabbed the hose to kind of pull it down, put the fire out. We had a hose ready, safety first, but did you know if you leave your hose outside in March, as I learned on that day, it will shatter into not one, not two, not three, but billions of pieces when you need it. You ever had this happen? You're laughing. Have you broken your hose? It can happen. And so Dad sent me in there to get a 5-gallon bucket to carry it back and forth to the fire like it was Little House on the Prairie or something. And I'm 8. what am I going to do? I was soaked in water, and Dad has like a snow shovel, and he's beating the flames down. He tells Mom to call the fire department. And honestly, I didn't think we were going to make it. Like, it was blowing away from our house, but our yard we didn't use for much, just like a yard. But our neighbors ran cattle. And so if the flame left the fence, we're about to burn down our neighbor's livelihood. And, oh man, now it's getting serious. We got to put this flame out. Dad was there with the snow shovel. I didn't know, honestly, if he was going to make it or not. This fire was just out of control. And it didn't even feel like we were being neglectful or like doing it wrong or whatever. Like, y'all burn trash. We burn trash hundreds of times. We never had this problem. It's like we took our eyes off it for like literally just 1 second, and then it just sparked and fired out of control. I'm getting like worried just talking about it. It felt like just sometimes you do stuff that you can foresee going wrong. This wasn't one of those days. Just 1 second, just 1 minute, out of sight, out of mind, and it got out of control. And I wonder if this is how Nehemiah felt by the time we got to the end of his book. For 12 chapters, we've seen Nehemiah's faithfulness, and he's doing the right things, and he's working hard to, he even listened to my sermons. He had all these like marks of beautiful kingdom living that he brought out. For 12 whole chapters, it's like he burned the trash of his people, so to speak, to create some holiness or some righteousness or some fresh life in their garages. He's just burning it out, cleaning it up. It's like the good old days, fully recaptured. I wonder even if Nehemiah felt like this is going to be when we see all the promises of God come to fruition. Moses didn't see it, Abraham didn't see it, David didn't see it. Maybe we're going to see it here in my day. I wonder if Nehemiah thought, we're going to do it right this time. We're going to get the right walls, the right temple, the right way to live, and God is finally going to bless us perfectly and fully. So for 12 chapters, we've seen this, right? Things are going well for all the right reasons with all the right stuff. But then Nehemiah, it feels like, looks away for just 1 second. And I'd love to read in Nehemiah chapter 13 and see what happens. We'll start here in verse 4. So Nehemiah writes it this way: Before this had happened, Eliashib the priest, who had been appointed as supervisor of the storerooms of the temple of our God, and who was also a relative of Tobiah, had converted a large storeroom and placed it at Tobiah's disposal. The room had previously been used for storing the grain offerings, the frankincense, various articles for the temple, and the tithes of grain, new wine, olive oil, all of which were prescribed for the Levites, the singers, and the gatekeepers, as well as the offerings for the priests. I was not in Jerusalem at that time, for I had returned to King Artaxerxes of Babylon in the 32nd year of his reign, though I later asked his permission to return. When I arrived back in Jerusalem, I learned about Eliashib's evil deed in providing Tobiah with a room in the courtyards of the temple of God. I became very upset. I threw all of Tobiah's belongings out of the room. Then I demanded that the rooms be purified, and I brought back the articles for God's temple, the grain offerings, and the frankincense. All right, we'll pause there. Not for the last time today, we're going to see Nehemiah get this kind of fiery, angry passion. He's going to get upset. I think he felt kind of like we did at that trash fire. He took his eyes off the people for literally just 1 second to go and visit the king, and he probably felt like everything was great. He didn't need to micromanage everybody for once. He had a good system. He had good laws. The temple was kind of back in worship, like he could sit back and reap the harvest of all that he had done well. He probably felt like, hey man, I spent 12 chapters building a beautiful kingdom just for 1 second, just for once, people. Could you just keep it going without me? Would that be okay? Could I take my vacation back and see the king and then just let you out of my sight for just 1 second? Would that be okay? And then he comes back and, man, he gets angry. He even throws the belongings of these people and their little tent all the way out of the temple. He couldn't take his eyes off them for 1 second, and then they're buying and selling in the temple court in a way that wasn't good. So why is Nehemiah so mad about this? Why is he so mad? In a lot of ways, he's mad for the right reasons. This guy is setting up a special room for himself in the temple court. Eliashib and Tobiah, they don't understand what the purpose of the temple is all about, right? We talked about this last week. Are these people, in giving themselves an important dwelling in the temple of God, are they seeing the right purpose of it? Because the purpose, number one, is that it should be set aside for worship. The temple is the place in the Old Testament where God's presence, his very presence, is said to dwell. But instead, Eliashib and Tobiah and these guys, they decide that it's not the place where God should dwell, it's the place where we should dwell. Whereas God should be at the center of the temple, they're saying, no, we'll put ourselves into the center of the temple. They're kind of appropriating what should have been God's space for themselves. It's not good. I don't think it was just God that they decided to try to knock down a peg, so to speak, because the temple storehouse was supposed to be for the ministers. We looked at this last week, didn't we? That the Levites and those dedicated to the work of the worship of God and their care for the people, they were entrusted with these tithes and gifts and offerings. But here, it seems like Eliashib and Tobiah are trying to almost run like a side game. Get a little off the top, skim some for themselves. You guys know what I'm talking about? If there's money to be made, hey, there's money to be made for me, right? This is what Eliashib and Tobiah think. They want to have a rich tent dwelling in the temple so that they can profit from the people coming in and out. Maybe they even think it's fine if the priests get all theirs, as long as I get a little bit of mine too. I'm going to put myself right in here so that I can just put my finger into all these pies and make sure I get my cut and enrich myself. Do you know people like this? All too happy to do the right thing so long as they get theirs also. If you look away for just 1 second, their hand is in that cookie jar of good deeds. You know some Eliashibs, you know some Tobiahs, these people who are skimming and greedy for position and for gain and for power and riding the coattails of something good. Does it make you mad? Are you an Eliashib or a Tobiah, riding the coattails of something good? Putting your finger in the pie? It made Nehemiah pretty mad. Because there was one more purpose in the temple too, wasn't there? The temple's purpose to care for the poor. So Eliashib and Tobiah aren't just robbing God or not just robbing the priests, but now they're taking money out of the mouths of the poor. This is what the temple was supposed to do, to look out for the least of everyone in the community, the least of everyone in the land, the little guy, the overseen, the marginalized. But these guys have flipped temple worship upside down and say the temple should actually look out for whoever's in charge and celebrate their ministry. I'm Eliashib, the chief priest. It should be about me, not about the people. It's like Nehemiah looks away for 1 second and this cardboard box of greed just lands in the tall, dry grass of the Jewish people and it just goes catch fire. This hard-won society and beautiful kingdom that Nehemiah has labored to build for 12 chapters, it's already starting to burn down a little bit, isn't it? Just 1 second, just 5 verses, Nehemiah looks away and everything is falling apart a little bit, you know. In short, Nehemiah is angry that people are using what was God's for themselves. He's mad about it. And we still see places like this burning down, don't we? People using the name of God for their own ends. People using Jesus like a mascot to cover over their own ambition. People more interested in being popular and in being known than in looking out and caring for one another. And not just churches out there, it, I believe, happens here at Element Church too. We have some people doing some things, if we're being honest, for the wrong kinds of reasons. Or do you think maybe that's just a problem Nehemiah faced and now we're good? We have the right heart and the right attitude all the time. Man, I think this type of selfish ambition is still around. It may even be worse. Nehemiah is angry that Eliashib is serving himself with his position rather than serving others. Nehemiah's mad about this too. Have you ever seen anybody in leadership do the same kind of thing? Have you seen somebody use their position for serving themselves and not others? And you know, that's kind of the trick with leadership, isn't it? Like, there's something about being in leadership that the scale of the problem, if you create it for good, it's really good for everybody. But if you do bad, it's really bad for everybody, right? And so for better or worse, that's just kind of how leadership works. And so Nehemiah was like trying to have this trash fire, healing the people, purging the people, purifying the people, something that would burn away their garbage and create space in their hearts for worship of the true God. You know, we needed rid of the boxes, and fire needed to do that. And so I think good leadership, likewise, keeps us rid of some of the things we need to get out of our lives that block us from experiencing God. But poor leadership is like that fire out of control. What was intended to burn away and create space ends up having the opposite effect, even burning down your very house and that of your neighbor. Here Nehemiah sees that Eliashib and Tobiah, they're doing the second thing, leadership actions that burn everything down. Their lives and that of their neighbor, the people they were supposed to serve. So he decides, I'm going to put the fire out myself. He grabs that hose. He grabs that snow shovel. He grabs that 5-gallon bucket, and he wants to toss them and their ill-gotten gains all the way out of the temple, all the way out of the worship space, making clear both to them and to everyone who sees that this is what happens to people who use the things of God to enrich themselves. There's no space for you here. Get out of here. Get out of here, right? So Nehemiah throws him out. For the right reasons, I wonder? So here we see an interesting hallmark of chapter 13. Nehemiah is going to use the term remember 4 times. He wants to remember some things. And so this is the first one. Let's see how he puts it here in verse 14. He says, remember this good deed, O my God. Do not forget all that I have faithfully done for the temple of my God and for its services. On the one hand, this absolutely is a good deed. We want holiness. We want the temple to be as clear as possible. Right worship really matters. But I wonder sometimes, did Nehemiah do this for the Lord and for the people? Or did he do it so that he can increase his own standing in the eyes of the Lord? In other words, did he undertake this temple cleansing action for the right reasons or so that he would look good? You know, the scripture is not always clear about how somebody acts is good or bad. Sometimes you kind of have to read between the lines, a sense, use interpretation, use the power of prayer, and say, like, what was in Nehemiah's heart as he did this? Cleansing the temple was good, but did he do it for the right reasons? You know, one way I think that we can check to see if an action is good or bad in the scripture is to compare it to the life, the actions, and the teachings of Jesus in a similar situation. So if Nehemiah is cleansing this temple, maybe we can remember that Nehemiah isn't the only one who drove people out of the temple. Who else drove people out of the temple? You guys have been to Sunday school, seen your flannel graph lately, right? Jesus did this. Jesus drove people out of the temple. And really for a very similar reason. You know, in Jesus' ministry, he comes out to the temple, should have been a house of worship, and yet people are buying and selling and enriching themselves and moving themselves right into the spaces they shouldn't, just like Eliashib and just like Tobiah. And so I'd love to read Luke's version of this in chapter 19. And I wonder if as we do, if we can kind of notice or see what Jesus' own motivation for these actions is. Let's see if we can pluck it out here as we start here in verse 45. Then Jesus entered the temple and began to drive out the people selling animals for sacrifices. He said to them, "The scriptures declare, 'My temple will be a house of prayer, but you have turned it into a den of thieves.'" After that, he taught daily in the temple, but the leading priests, the teachers of religious law, and the other leaders of the people began planning how to kill him. But they could think of nothing because all the people hung on every word he said. All right, just bookmark that in 47 in your brain for a second, that this kind of friction, this pressure that Jesus was experiencing, we'll come back to that in a minute. But first, I want to point out that there's nothing new under the sun, right? Nehemiah and Jesus both faced the same type of greedy, money-changing people who want to use the work of God to enrich themselves and bring themselves more stuff. There's nothing new under the sun, right? We face it. Jesus faced it. Nehemiah faced it. This is what humanity is. We just have a way of setting our lives on fire. But did you catch Jesus' particular motivation there in verse 46? What does he say? He says, "My Father's house should be a house of," what? Of prayer. Of prayer. Jesus wants to refocus his people on the work of the ministry, which is to say, gathering people into prayer and using that as the foundation for any sort of gathered community. Not selling stuff, but praying and honoring the Lord our God. That's what Jesus' motivation was. This is why, by the way, in 2 weeks, we're going to start our new series, and we're calling it Copycat, Learning to Pray Like Jesus. If you've solved prayer, you don't have to come. Stay home, you know. But if you would like to learn how to pray like Jesus prayed and why prayer was so important to him, come back out and we're going to look at the life and ministry of Jesus and see how we can pray like he did and have an effective ministry like he did, right? But Jesus is the one who focuses on prayer. What does Nehemiah focus on? Is it prayer? In doing the right thing by cleansing the temple, has Nehemiah actually accidentally become in danger, just like Eliashib and Tobiah were, of putting himself in the center, looking to himself to solve the problems, looking to himself to try to stamp that fire out, and just like these guys, focusing off of God and onto his own good works? Is Nehemiah, in trying to make this beautiful kingdom happen, actually guilty of making this fire spread a little bit out of control? To make matters worse for Nehemiah, it's not just Eliashib and Tobiah who are the bad guys, right? Everyone is buying and selling against the rules. Look here in verse 19. After Nehemiah cleanses the temple, it kind of gets worse, right? "Then I commanded that the gates of Jerusalem should be shut as darkness fell every Friday evening, not to be opened until the Sabbath day ended. I sent some of my own servants to guard the gates so that no merchandise could be brought in on the Sabbath day. The merchants and tradesmen with a variety of wares camped outside Jerusalem once or twice. But I spoke sharply to them and said, 'What are you doing out here camping around the wall? If you do this again, I will arrest you.' And that was the last time they came on the Sabbath. Then I commanded the Levites to purify themselves and guard the gates in order to preserve the holiness of the Sabbath." All right, so here we see Nehemiah cleaning out and shutting down not only commerce in the temple, but literally everywhere in the city that they weren't doing it according to the law of God. One of the rules that the Jewish people were supposed to follow was to keep the Sabbath day, which in that time was Friday sundown till Saturday sundown. And that meant no work, which meant no selling, which meant no buying, which meant none of this stuff these merchants were trying to do was allowed. Nehemiah took this very seriously. The Sabbath was supposed to be set apart as a day of worship, of rest, of focusing on the Lord, of fellowship with your family. Nehemiah would have loved Chick-fil-A, right? Closed on Sunday. Unbelievable, right? And so, of course, I'm joking a little bit, but the Chick-fil-A people get it in a way, that Sabbath is not something optional that you do when you have extra time to do it. It's a foundational pinnacle of your week that you build everything else around. And Nehemiah is saying, you guys are not valuing the Sabbath. That's not what God wants for you. I'm going to go the extra mile. If you break it again, I will arrest you. That's a big deal. That's a big deal. So Nehemiah gets this zeal, this passion, and he decides he's going to push everybody into as holy of a living as possible. Is this a good idea that Nehemiah had, I wonder? On the one hand, prioritizing holiness absolutely is a good deed, right? Living how God commands us to do absolutely matters. It absolutely does. It absolutely does. I'm not trying to soft sell that today. And this is why I think Nehemiah calls out once more to God. This is our second remember here in verse 22. Remember this good deed also, O my God. Have compassion upon me according to your great and your unfailing love. I do think it's interesting here, though, that Nehemiah asks God to remember his good deeds once he has accomplished them, and he does not ask God into the process or submit himself to his will. He doesn't ask God to say, hey, God, look out for your people. He doesn't make prayer his primary driver like Jesus taught us to do when he cleansed the temple. In fact, he's looking to his own strength and his own passion, I think, and to hope that God rewards him for doing his best and achieving a lot of stuff. And I think in this way, Nehemiah is just a lot like us. Do we ever try to earn God's favor through our good deeds? Doing the right stuff, keeping the right holiness codes? Say to God, remember me for all my good deeds and stuff that I have done? I think in this way, Nehemiah is a lot like the kid in class who raises their hand and asks for extra homework. You guys remember this kid? Are you this kid? Man, do you like that kid? They're not content to leave well enough alone when the teacher forgets the homework. They're like, oh, teacher, remember the homework. Remember me. Remember that I have a passion for learning, like so rare in this culture that I will ask for extra homework at the end of the class. Remember me, oh teacher, and my great good deeds according to your unfailing love and compassion. And the teacher's like, man, I didn't want to grade that homework. Like, just leave it at home, We forget the quiz. Oh, teacher, remember the quiz. I need to learn. I need a future. Remember me when you go back into the back room and you put your chart of who your favorite student is. Remember me because I'm asking for homework at the end of class. You know this kind of kid? I think there's one in every class. What's the deal with that kid, Is this how we treat the Lord, though? Hoping that he has a scorecard for us? That he notices how much we want to be passionate for him more than for our peers, that he wants us to know like how much more we're doing than the average person. Remember me, God, I'm doing all this stuff, not like those other students, not like those other Christians. Remember me, because I'm going above and beyond. Remember me, and it feels like Nehemiah's got his hand in the air. Remember me, oh my Lord, when it comes homework time, because I did my homework, not like these other kids, and remember that I did the good thing, and they did the bad thing. I think Nehemiah is hoping that by enforcing Sabbath, it's like homework, right? It's not a bad thing. It's good for the life of the people. But I think Nehemiah, in trying to do a good thing and enforcing the law of God on people, doesn't even realize how much spark and fire is spreading, right? So let's do this social experiment. Go to class on Monday and raise your hand and ask for extra homework, and then just see if the people in your class like that or don't like that, right? Don't do it. I can save you the trouble. They don't like it, and Nehemiah's people didn't either. They're like, man, you're doing the right thing. You're reminding us of the laws, but there's this friction, just like there was kind of when Jesus cleansed the temple that we bookmark in our brain, right? There's some tension between him and the people. Man, have you ever tried to do the right thing and had it burned down anyway? Nehemiah's done it twice. Zealous for the law of God, which is absolutely a good thing, and yet the people are still kind of on fire, burning away out of control, right? And here's the difficult part about doing what's right. We can't control what others do, and it just makes us mad. We reap the consequences. It's not our fault, and so sometimes we just blame others for everything going wrong. You know? Sometimes it's not even our fault, but if we're not careful, that friction sparks into flame our own hearts, a bitterness or an anger or even a rage that comes out at the worst possible time. Let's see what happened to Nehemiah when he got to the straw that broke the camel's back of wrongdoing of the people. I'll pick it up here in verse 23. He says it this way: "About the same time, I realized that some of the men of Judah had married women from Ashdod and Ammon and Moab. Furthermore, half their children spoke the language of Ashdod or some other people and could not speak the language of Judah at all." All right, so pause there. Here, what Nehemiah's bringing out is that they're bringing in foreign people into their community, and what really was at issue is bringing in the worship of those foreign gods. And so they're saying, you're not trusting God anymore, you're trusting all the pagan deities, and what's more, they're the ones teaching your kids how to speak, how to worship, and how to behave. Why have you abdicated your leadership of your home to some foreign worshiping God person instead of somebody who loves and knows the true God? That's kind of what's hiding underneath the surface here. So in verse 25, Nehemiah confronts them. He says it this way: "I confronted them. I called down curses on them. I beat some of them. I pulled out their hair. I made them swear in the name of God that they would not let their children intermarry with the pagan people of the land." Wasn't this exactly what led King Solomon of Israel into sin? I demanded. There was no king from any nation who could compare to him, and God loved him, made him king over all Israel, but even he was led into sin by his foreign wives. So how could you even think of committing this sinful deed and acting unfaithfully towards God by marrying foreign women? One of the sons of Joiada, son of Eliashib, the high priest, had married a daughter of Sanballat the Horonite, so I banished him from my presence. You guys remember these names? Eliashib's the clown, buying and selling in the temple right here at verse 1. Sanballat from chapter 4, he's one of the haters who wanted to squish Nehemiah's work, and here they are doing wrong stuff again, and Nehemiah's like, didn't I fix you people already? I did not. So verse 29, "Remember them, O my God, for they have defiled the priesthood and the solemn vows of the priests and the Levites." This is our third remember. But it's a different kind of remember, isn't it? Not remember me for my good deeds, remember them and remember to punish them. Man, this is a switch in tone, isn't it? Two remembers focused on God and God's favor towards Nehemiah himself, even for the right things and probably even for the right reasons. And here, man, I'm just not so sure anymore. It feels like Nehemiah is putting himself into the judgment seat of God and saying, I know what's right, I know how to fix it, make sure you do it, God. Minister your judgment on them. Now, I'm not saying that we can't speak truth to our culture. I'm not saying that we can't have a confrontational conversation with somebody that needs it. I'm not saying we should be an anything goes people. I'm not saying any of that. But I am saying if our primary goal is to condemn people into God's punishment rather than to restore people to God's grace, we're doing it wrong. And here Nehemiah doesn't feel like he wants a gracious restoration. It feels like he wants punishment and justice, you know? Jeremiah put it this way: "Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord." And Nehemiah put it this way: "Vengeance is mine, I will repay, says Nehemiah." Nehemiah beats them. He pulls out their hair. I mean, honestly, on the one hand, they deserved it, didn't they? They just made promises for 12 chapters, and 5 verses later are going back on them. Nehemiah's mad. They knew better. They just did whatever they wanted. And do you ever feel like this when somebody does something that they shouldn't? Like you just wanted to beat them and pull out their hair and like choke them and like, get it together, man. You know what you're doing. Stop doing this. And just inflict on them some sort of pain because they've caused you pain and they've caused God's pain and they've caused the rules pain. And we just get so mad and we want to beat them and we want to pull out our hair. And we read Nehemiah chapter 13 and we're like, I'm going to start beating some people. I'm going to start pulling out some hair. You ever feel like that? Put your hand up, don't put your hand up, right? Because we all kind of felt like that. We've all kind of felt like that. So what do we do with the fact that Nehemiah felt like that and then went through with it, did it? Is the message of Nehemiah here as a book to say we need to be a Nehemiah leader? Take no prisoners. Stand up for what is right. Accept no substitute. Beat your opponents. Pull out their beard. Let their beard grow back. pull it out again, Is that the message here? Keep holiness so central that just kick everybody out. So I'm the new lead pastor here. Is this what I should do? You make a mistake. I beat you. I kick you out of the church. I pull out your beard. And then I go to God and I pray, God, remember what they did to me and punish them whenever they find their new church. Is that what I should be as a pastor at Element Church here on week 6? You guys are like, no, please don't do that to us. It's in the Bible though, right? What's kind of sad is that this is the primary way that Nehemiah has been taught in the American church in the last 10 years, that we need Nehemiah leaders filled with passion, just fight for the right, not to party, that's Beastie Boys, but fight for the right, for what's good and holy and true. And you can see Nehemiah's passion, and it's like sometimes we got to do that, and we get so confused. But I think that if we do it like Nehemiah does, we're going to reap what Nehemiah also sowed. And I don't want to have a life like Nehemiah did. I don't want to have 12 chapters of fire forged and it burns away at the end. I think we need to look past Nehemiah to someone greater. To someone greater. What if the firefighters who ended up showing up at our yard, very embarrassing, right? I've never seen happier firefighters, by the way. It's like a volunteer brigade, and they had like the water guns on the trucks and driving it around, putting out the fire like it was the best day of their life, right? What if they had showed up and said, hey, let me see your permit. We don't have a permit. Oh, you don't have a permit? I'm going to let your yard burn down. And what's more, I'm going to sit here and watch while your neighbor's yard burns down. And then that's your fault, so we're going to sue you, go into your bank account, take your home, take your assets, and hand it to your neighbor whose house burned down. You didn't have a permit. You shouldn't have done that. It's your fault. You took your eyes off the fire for just 1 second, and now here it is. Pay the consequences. Remember them, oh fire brigade, right? And punish them. Is that what firefighters do? Is anybody a firefighter in here? After all the shade I've thrown at like students and dentists, you guys are like, yes, I am. But we love you guys. You don't check our permits. You show up and you put out the fire. You don't ask whose fault it is. You save the life. You don't say who's wrong. We just protect the property. You put your life at risk to do that. That's what those firefighters did for us. And that's what I want to be as a pastor at Element Church, is a firefighting pastor who puts out fire like Jesus does, like those firefighters did. Once the fire was gone, they're like, okay, now we can talk about permitting, and now we can talk about how to make it right, and now we can talk about how to not do it again. But we just put the fire out. There's grace, there's love, there's homecoming, Nehemiah, though, doubles down a little bit here at the very end of the book, chapter, who knows what chapter, verses 30 and 31. I got a little fired up, excuse me. Nehemiah says it this way: I purged out everything foreign. I assigned tasks to the priest and to the Levites. I made certain that each knew his work. I also made sure that the supply of wood for the altar and the first portions of the harvest were brought in at the proper times. Fourth, remember this in my favor, oh my God. Bookends. Nehemiah says, I took my eyes off of you people for just 1 second. I will not let it happen again. I'm going to make sure everything's done. I'm going to make sure everybody has their checklist and their work done. And you're going to remember what I did to those people who I kicked out and those people whose hair I pulled out and those people that I beat. Remember to do it in the right time. Remember this, oh God, Nehemiah cries out. Book's over. We don't read any Old Testament narrative between this moment and the coming of Jesus Christ. Nehemiah is working so hard to make sure that God remembers him. But do we remember God in the midst? It's almost like Nehemiah expected that his fire-forged faith would be one where he has to experience some fire and some heat and some testing, and then he'll come out of it one day, and then everything will be beautiful with no problems, no purpose. He'll enter into the beautiful, perfected phase of following God. But that's not how life works, I don't think. I don't think we're ever free in this life from mistakes from ourselves or from those of others. I think that this fire forging on heat and the consequences we face on a daily basis simply is the human condition. I don't think we're ever going to be free of forging. And that's the end of the book. There's no real resolution. Nehemiah hopes God remembers him. He hopes the people turn back. And Nehemiah couldn't set it right. We can't either. Why do we think that we can do better than Nehemiah did? One of the heroes of the faith, a man that God was with, 13 chapters of success, and we can do better, right? We can't do better than Nehemiah did. We can't. We do the right thing all the time fire gets out anyway. We need to look past Nehemiah to somebody greater. And of course, I'm talking about the person of Jesus, aren't I? Jesus offers us a better way, doesn't he? Instead of beating others, he says, turn the other cheek. Instead of demanding restitution, he says, give your shirt to somebody who asks for your cloak as well. Instead of demanding that God punish and remember your enemies, what does he say? Love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you. What sort of sense does that make? Jesus says, instead of trying to squash the fire of life yourself, trust me. He took the fire of sin, the punishment that was due for our own wrongdoing and the wrongdoing of every single person on earth. He accepted this punishment and pain for us. He says, if somebody needs to be beaten and somebody needs to have their hair pulled out, it's going to be me. Nehemiah beat others, pulled their hair out, and that's what Jesus suffered for us, absolutely, on his way to the cross. Today, as we close our service, we get to celebrate the communion meal and remember this, Jesus going to the cross and suffering and dying for us. I want to read Jesus' institution of this practice in Luke chapter 22, and I want to kind of read it through the lens of what we've been talking about today, of remembering God, remembering ourselves. Who remembers who here? Who's suffering for who here in Luke 22? It says it this way. When the time came, Jesus and the apostles sat down together at the table. Jesus said, I have been very eager to eat this Passover meal with you before my suffering begins. For I tell you now, I won't eat this meal again until its meaning is fulfilled in the kingdom of God. Then he took a cup of wine. He gave thanks to God for it. Then he said, take this and share it among yourselves, for I will not drink wine again until the kingdom of God has come. He took some bread and gave thanks to God for it. Then he broke it in pieces and gave it to the disciples, saying, this is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. After supper, he took another cup of wine and said, this cup is the new cup of the new covenant between God and his people, an agreement confirmed with my blood, which is poured out as a sacrifice for you. But here at this table, sitting among us as a friend, is the man who will betray me. For it has been determined that the Son of Man must die. But what sorrow awaits the one who betrays him? Then the disciples began to ask each other, which of them would ever do such a thing? So they began to argue among themselves about who would be the greatest among them. Man. As today we have this great privilege of partaking in this communion meal together, I hope that we do it like we should and honestly not like his disciples did. I mean, Jesus is literally sitting there saying, I'm about to break my body, like die for you. I'm about to pour my blood out, like literally for you. And what did the disciples say? Who's the greatest? Who is Jesus going to remember? Who's done their homework? Who's got the most zeal and the most passion? Who's going to be set apart by their love and their good deeds? And remember us, they say to Jesus. And man, I wonder if we're like the disciples, working so hard to make sure that God remembers us, we forget to remember God. This Last Supper, this communion meal, the whole purpose of it is that Jesus has already remembered us. He remembered us before the beginning of time. He came to earth, even though he knew that we were people who set everything on fire, left, right, and sideways. We can't fix it ourselves. He remembered us. He didn't look away from us even for 1 second. He looked us full in the face, knew everything about us. He loved us, and he died for us anyway. Perhaps we could be less like the disciples and less like Nehemiah in chapter 13, hoping to pile up enough good deeds to be remembered by God himself, and a little bit more like somebody who knew that that wasn't going to work. A little bit more like somebody who society had forgotten, and somebody who Luke chapter 23 tells us was crucified beside Jesus on that last day. I want to read in chapter 23, verse 39. He says that one of the criminals hanging beside Jesus on the cross scoffed at him. He said, you're the Messiah? Prove it by saving yourself. Save us too while you're at it. The other criminal protested, don't you fear God even when you have been sentenced to die? We deserve to die for our crimes, but this man has done nothing wrong. Then he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Jesus replied, I assure you, today you will be with me in paradise. And Element Church, good news today is that Jesus will always remember us. He always has remembered us. He always will. You don't have to beat somebody into submission, you have to accept the one who was beaten on our behalf. Accept the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. So today I want to be like that thief and ask God to remember. Today I want to be like Jesus and pour myself out for someone else. And I want to invite you to come to the Lord's table today as we remember. We're going to do it a little bit different than we have in some weeks past, but I invite you to come down and take this bread like Jesus' body broken for you and this cup that we can drink and remember his sacrifice for our sins. So you can send somebody from your group down and collect them right here at the front. Then I encourage you to return to your seat and pray together and think and remember what Jesus really has done. Maybe there's some sin to confess, or maybe a prayer you need to pray. Let's not hurry this moment. Let's remember what Jesus has done. He told us in Luke, when you do this, remember me. Let's remember him together today. I invite you to come.